When you receive peer reviewer comments back on a piece that you submitted to a peer-reviewed journal, what's the best way to respond? Stick around and let's talk about 10 best practice tips today on this episode of Navigating Academia. What's up, everybody? My name is Dr. J. Phoenix Singh, and I want to welcome you to this episode of Navigating Academia, your leading source for guidance on how to be able to progress your career in academia. Now, as always, I appreciate the love, so please do take time to like and share this video with your friends, your colleagues, your students. Subscribe to our channel, hit that bell to be able to make sure you get notifications from when we post new content, and also comment below. You can follow us at these social media accounts. So, today we're going to be discussing how best to respond to reviewer comments on pieces that you've submitted to peer-reviewed journals. Now, obviously, if your piece is straight out rejected, the journal's not going to ask you for itemized responses to those reviewers' comments. However, hopefully that's not going to be the case for you, and you're going to get a lot of great hopefully constructive feedback from experts in your niche, and this is going to be able to help you really maximize the quality of your piece before it ends up being published in that journal. But it's very important that you're strategic and really take a tactical approach in terms of how you're responding to these comments. So today I'm going to be sharing with you 10 best practice tips that you can utilize during this all-important process. Because if you submit responses to reviewer comments and they're not comprehensive enough, or you haven't done a great job in terms of the simple communication, the written communication that you're using, your piece, which could have come across really well, can be turned down upon subsequent review by the associate editor, or especially if they send your comments back to those peer reviewers and say, hey, listen, did this authorship team fully respond to your comments? You want to make sure you come across well. So let's jump right in. The first thing you need to know is that reviewers vary across 3 key dimensions. The first is how comprehensive their comments are. You're going to end up getting some peer reviewers who essentially, either because of speed, or hopefully not, but in some cases lack of caring, or simply because they were at the end of their deadline to be able to submit that peer review, or they're getting hounded by the associate editor saying, what is taking so long? You gotta read this piece and give comments. But for whatever reason, they're going to submit a very brief, very tight, usually 1-paragraph response. It's going to be overly general. It's either going to be positive or negative. Very rarely is it neutral, because these peer reviews, usually they're not simply descriptive in nature. They're not going to say, I read this piece and here's what it was about. That's not the function of peer review. They're supposed to say, here are things that could be improved, and here are things that, right now are terrific that this authorship team did. But on the other hand, you can get peer reviewers, and this happens, it's a lot more likely to happen, where the comments are exhaustive, and where it's not just a bunch of little comments, it'll be comments kind of grouped together in multiple sentences or paragraphs. They can be literally pages and pages long of comments. Now, this is a mixed blessing. Obviously, if the comments are constructive in nature, it can really help, and even though you won't know who that reviewer is, you should be very, very grateful to them for having put that work in, even though it is obviously creating a lot more work for you and your authorship team. The second dimension is how agreeable or disagreeable those reviewers are. In other words, how nice are they, or how vicious are they? You're going to find, obviously, that even if somebody doesn't agree with what you say, they can say it in a very nice and respectful way. But there's also peer reviewers who, just like these days, the majority of young people, when they're breaking up in relationships, they do it via text these days. And what happens is that because of that, there's no face-to-face interaction, and you can basically say whatever you want. And this clearly is going to be made even worse if those peer reviewers are anonymous, which they are. And so because of that, they feel they can say anything, and this can be very positive, which is great, or they can be really mean and really rude. And blunt in a way that is not constructive in the slightest. And so this is a second, dimension people are going to vary on, and you need to be prepared for that. Even if it's the case where you have, multiple peer reviewers, usually you're going to have at least 2, sometimes up to 5 peer reviewers depending on the journal. What you're going to find is that, usually there's going to be one who's pretty vicious, and you need to be emotionally prepared for that. I still remember the first time that I saw a review like that, which was really vicious, and I just thought, what did I do in my life to deserve to be spoken to like this, right? So you just need to be prepared to see something said about your piece, which is your baby, which is really not nice. And finally, dimension number 3 is how open those peer reviewers are to allowing you to make revisions and resubmit your piece. Whether you've got an acceptance with minor revision, an acceptance with major revision, a revise and resubmit, any of those outcomes, you will be expected to submit responses to comments on, and because of that, you're given a really good chance of getting that piece published, especially if it's accept with minor or major revisions. Now, what each one of these different potential outcomes of your submission mean, I'm going to make a separate video to be able to discuss the big 5 of those, and I'll link that down in the description below if you want to check it out. But suffice it to say that sometimes, even if, let's say, you got 3 reviewers and 2 of them are like, yeah, this is pretty good, except with major revision, the third person could say straight up reject. Or you could get one person who's like, this is a great piece, and 2 others who are like, no, it's just not for me. In those cases where there's kind of a mix, it's up to the associate editor to be able to make the call in terms of whether or not they think, you know what, we're just going to pass on the piece, or whether they say, you know what, one of them was positive, so if it's a case like that, they'll probably say revise and resubmit. If only one person says accept and somebody else is saying reject, or 2 other people are saying reject, the likelihood that they're going to say, you know what, accept anyway, is really pretty low, even though I have heard of it happening in the past. But those are the 3 dimensions that your reviewers are going to vary on. So you've got your reviewer comments back, and the associate editor handling your piece hasn't straight up rejected it. So what happens next? Well, the usual structure of these comments is either one or a set of paragraphs which are loosely structured and contain general comments about the overall worthiness of the piece overall, as well as specific comments about particular sentences, sections, tables, references, and so forth. Now, some reviewers may be even kind enough to have already itemized their comments for you, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, but you shouldn't expect that. And reviewers, you have to remember, they volunteered to do this. They're not getting paid. So you need to be grateful for the fact that they even read your piece in the first place, regardless of how positive or negative they are, regardless of whether they've itemized things for you or if you have to do that themselves. So that's just a precursor to these 10 tips. But let's jump into tip number 1. So before even beginning to reply to each of the reviewer's comments, you need to include a few sentences that literally they're just at the very top, and they express gratitude to the reviewers for their valuable time and excellent comments. Always be very positive about the comments, and state that the manuscript has been significantly improved in terms of its quality because you've gone through this process and you've addressed the comments. It's very important that you express that gratitude in this overall kind of mini paragraph. Could be 2 to 3 sentences at the very beginning before you start your itemization. And it's really important because the associate editor is going to read it. You're going to come across well. If they do send it back to those peer reviewers for a re-review, obviously that's going to come across well because they feel that they're being appreciated. Oftentimes in academia, you don't feel appreciated. What can I say? It's the nature of the beast, especially if you're doing peer reviews. So for the love of God, say something nice. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is to be able to make an itemized list of every comment that each reviewer has. And these are both general comments as well as very specific comments. So for example, a general content may be the discussion needs to be more specific about how the piece has implications for future research. very general. Something specific may be, this reference is missing from the bibliography, even though it's mentioned in paragraph 2 of the introduction. That's very specific and arguably a lot more helpful, but obviously the general one is giving you kind of something that you overall need to address. So both of them are constructive, from that perspective. What you want to do is you want to make sure that you're separating these comments out by reviewer. In some cases, it can be really hard to tease apart comments, and it won't make sense to literally, copy and paste from the laundry list of comments you've got, and that'll usually be in an email that's sent to you by the associate editor, to copy and paste the exact statement. You may want to, when I say revise it, be very careful with that. But what I mean is, if somebody says, the discussion section is overall pretty good, period. However, comma, blah, 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 implications. Obviously, in terms of your itemized, comment that you're going to put in, you don't want to say, however, comma, da-da-da-da-da. You can just start with the da-da-da-da-da part of that. And in doing this, you're going to come up with a really nice, concise list of, reviewer 1, comment, colon, bup, response, colon, and then we're going to have to put that in, right? But this way, it's really nice and clean. Some people I've seen do it other ways where they literally just, write paragraphs in response and these things. That's not a great way to do this. You want to make sure that your piece is as rapidly screened again by the associate editor, let alone the individual reviewers if it goes out for re-review. You want it to go as fast as possible. Your goal is to get the thing published, right? So we need to do everything to be able to streamline that and to be able to maximize the likelihood that that piece is going to come out, right? Now, the good news about itemizing things, not only to say comment response, but comment 1, colon, comment 2, colon, etc. The good thing about that is, let's say that, and this happens all the time, that reviewers have the same or very similar comments. Now, if you do that, one thing that you can do is just kind of omit the comment or whatever for subsequent reviewers, but that sometimes can come across poorly. My recommendation is to say, under reviewer 2 and then, comment 3, colon, you can say, I put in parentheses usually, and I say, please see my response, or please see our response, depending how many authors there are, 1 or multiple, on the piece. Please see our response to reviewer 1, comment 6. There you go. Then it's taken care of, and the associate editor, let alone the peer reviewer, if they see it again, they're not going to feel like you consciously omitted something. So this is a great strategy that you can use. That's how you kind of set things up. Step number 3 is to disregard rude or rhetorical comments. If something is just worded in a way that is, downright offensive, that does happen all the time, or it's a rhetorical comment that just, there's no real response. They're just kind of, making a statement like, this piece contributes nothing to the field, period. It's not really worth saying comment 3, colon, and then copying and pasting that. What are you supposed to say as a response? Just a rhetorical comment, right, that they're making. My best strategy for these things is either to very gently reword it, right? Now, in the case of that rhetorical one, you can't do it. But if something is just really rude, you can make some, tweaks to it such that it is the identical comment, but that it's not, insanely rude. And the second piece is that you can just disregard the comment, right, and not address it. Now, even though I don't generally recommend that, there have been certain circumstances where that has been the most appropriate move. And I can tell you that several times the associate editors come back and said, we'd really like you actually to address that comment. And that is totally fair enough. But let the associate editor be the one to come back and say, listen, you really need to address this. And if it's something that is just really, really important, even if it's worded in a way that you totally don't agree with, but it's a pretty specific comment, jump in there and address it. Obviously, sometimes they're going to say something you don't agree with, and it's okay to not agree with everything that the reviewer says, so long as you show appreciation for it, and we'll get to that in later tips. But if somebody is just downright disagreeing with something, like, or saying that you need to do more research, like, they need to do another 6 months of follow-up, and that's just not possible for you to do, as you'll see in later tips and all, it would be appropriate to say something like, we're grateful to the reviewer for this insightful comment and agree that a longer follow-up period may have the possibility of further elucidating our results. Although it's beyond the scope of the current study to do so, we've been sure to include in our future research section in the discussion this suggestion, or in the limitations section we've added that. This is the great thing about limitations, implications sections and all in discussion sections of scientific pieces, because it gives you the chance to be able to really put in a lot of what your peer reviewers are saying are epic weaknesses of your piece. Tip number 4, you heard me just say it a second ago, find a way to say thank you for each constructive comment that you get. Again, even for things that may not be that constructive, even if you can say thank you, or we thank the reviewer for this comment, or we appreciate the reviewer's perspective on this important issue, make sure that the associate editor and the peer reviewer, if it goes back to them, that they see that you're not just being overly blunt, because being overly blunt can be taken any which way, and you don't want somebody who's reading into how you're responding to your reviewer comments, which I know may sound silly, but it does happen. You don't want people who are reading into it to be like, this team, they don't really even care about my comments, so on and so forth. You want to express gratitude at all times. Tip number 5 is that if you can find a way to not only be grateful, but to agree with something in each comment, even again, right, if they say, again, we'll use that example of, follow-up period isn't long enough, right? To say, we thank the reviewer for this insightful comment, and then, we agree that, it would be helpful to do such and such. Or let's say that they think your statistical analyses are wrong, and you can't do the analyses that they want because your statistical power isn't high enough, or you don't have the right kind of data, or whatever it is, right? You can say something along the lines of, we thank the reviewer for this insightful comment, and we agree that this kind of analysis would certainly be an appropriate way to test our hypothesis. That said, based on the current data set and its limitations, it's beyond the scope. However, we've been sure to include this as a recommendation again for future research. We put in our limitations, and that's a great way to be able to make sure that the reviewer doesn't feel like it's been totally ignored. And I can tell you that associate editors, they also don't want to feel like you're just ignoring comments or saying, well, we didn't do that analysis because we didn't think it was the right one to do. That's just not a good thing to say. I know that that's how you're going to feel many times, but you need to address it in a very tactful way, and that's the way to do it. Tip number 6 is a silly one, but it's one that I come across literally all the time, which is that you should recognize that if the peer reviewer refers you to someone's research and they say, the authors have missed out on 2 of the most seminal pieces in the literature, and then they mention the 2, you can be doggone sure that it's either their piece or the piece of a student of theirs or a colleague of theirs. It's a small field, and everybody believes their work is the most important work. I'm telling you right now. And everybody, of course, wants citations because it increases their citation count and hence their H-index, which is like a personal impact factor. And sometimes that's taken into consideration when it comes to things like how you rank in the field, depending on the website that you're using, if you're on ResearchGate or academia.edu or Google Scholar or whatever it is. And also sometimes your H-index is used to be able to determine if you get a raise or if you get to move up from, let's say, assistant to associate to full professor and get tenure in these things. Some people would say it's an arbitrary metric, but for other people it's very important to them. Now, if this is the case, the last thing you want to do is just say, no, that work's not important. That's a terrible idea. The best thing to do is just bite the bullet and cite the stuff, right? If they say, this work is very important, take a look at the piece, take a look at the abstract, or, read the whole thing if you have time. Find an appropriate place in your piece to be able to cite it, put it in the bibliography, and then respond to the comment and say, thank you so much, for this, insightful comment. We've been sure to look into this important work and have been certain to, cite it in the piece. And usually, when you insert something, it is really helpful and it expedites the process if you say where you inserted it. So sometimes, for example, the piece will actually have, like numbered lines of, for every single line of text. So you can say page 3, line 15, we added, this reference, this citation. That can be very, very helpful. Or if it's something where you're tracking changes, you can say paragraph 2 on, page 3, we inserted such and such. That's really helpful because this way, the associate editor or the peer reviewers don't have to be kind of hunting through the manuscript. That's never fun for them. Obviously leaves a bad taste in their mouth that they end up, being real frustrated, with having to spend an exorbitant amount of time on your piece. So it's a good way to be able to streamline things. But that's tip number 6. Tip number 7 is to consider the personality and research of the associate editor who's handling your piece when you're crafting your responses. Now, the best way I found to do this, if you don't personally know that academic, go on Google Scholar, go on ResearchGate, go on to academia.edu, find their last, 5-10 years of research, and take a look at anything that maybe has to do with your niche to be able to find out, what do they agree with, what don't they agree with about your work. This can really, have a lot to do with the likelihood not only that they're going to accept your piece, which shouldn't be the case, they should be very objective, but we're human beings and we have clinical judgment biases, or just, cognitive biases. What are you going to do, right? And people aren't going to realize they have them. One judgment bias is that we think that other people have more judgment biases than ourselves, which is not the case. Or we're better at identifying those judgment biases in other people than we are in ourselves. So just assume that if your associate editor is someone who really agrees with everything, in your piece, they've published things on similar topics, agreeing with things that you've said, or even if they're not in your niche, but they use similar methodology, etc., you can assume that they're going to be more sympathetic to your cause. And obviously, it's a great idea to go on to something like YouTube, for example, or Vimeo. Try to find examples of them speaking or giving talks to judge their personality. And the reason that you do this is to be able to try to maximize the goodness of fit of how you're writing your comments and your responses to those comments, rather, and how likely the associate editor is to appreciate your style versus not. For example, if it's a very warm person, you can use adjectives like, this was a very helpful comment, or we're extremely grateful, such and such. But if you have somebody who's maybe a little bit more old school or just a little bit more stoic, it's a better idea to avoid those adjectives and to be very straightforward and emotionless and blunt, and that's going to come across a lot better. Obviously, the cultural background, of the individual is also a mediating factor there that you should take into consideration. But it's a good idea to kind of get to know the associate editor a little bit, at least on paper, if you don't know them personally, when they're handling your piece. Because again, if you can maximize that goodness of fit, it doesn't guarantee anything. However, it certainly doesn't hurt. Tip number 8 is, understandably, submit your responses in a timely fashion. Now, no, this doesn't mean that you should get it done as soon as possible and submit the comment responses the next day. That's a really bad idea because even though they could be amazing and you spent a lot of time and a lot of energy and your team rallied with each other and you got everything done, they could be the best reviewer comments ever, but I can tell you that the associate editor is going to get it and say, did they even spend any time on this? It just doesn't come across great. Obviously, you also don't want to wait a month to be able to return the stuff. It's best, no matter how long it takes you, 1 day, 2 days, a week, whatever, wait at least 1.5 to 2 weeks to be able to submit those reviewer comments. It may seem arbitrary, but it's a good idea to basically, play the midfield here in terms of too soon and obviously never too late. You want to give that impression in terms of, the timing of your submission, that you've really put a lot of thought and effort into this thing, and that's going to be appreciated, especially when your responses are high quality. Tip number 9 is to prepare yourself for multiple rounds of peer review, not just that first round, and also to have to argue against rejection if you're dealing with a higher impact journal. Now, In terms of the first case, so dealing with multiple rounds of peer review, again, the higher the impact factor of the journal, the more likely you are to be able to face this, and the more that your piece gets revised and resubmit decisions by peer reviewers, the more you can expect that it's going to go out for another full round of peer review, be it to the same peer reviewers or even other peer reviewers. For most journals, when you submit a peer review, you can say, would you be willing to re-review this? And a lot of people say no. And if that's the case, you may get 2 reviewers of your original, let's say 3, who are the same, and one who's totally new on the scene. And there's obviously benefits and drawbacks to something like that happening, where you get these kinds of alternatives coming in for subsequent rounds. But if you have a really high impact journal that you're submitting to, so for example, my highest impact publication, the journal has an impact factor of I think 32, or at least it did when I published the piece, which was many years ago now, about 7 years ago now. But so it's probably higher now. I would expect. It's a huge medical journal. It's a nationwide medical journal. But that said, I remember us not only going through many rounds and having many more peer reviewers than I was used to, but the piece ended up on 2 occasions. The associator came back and said, "Listen, we got to reject the piece. Yes, 2 people said accept the thing with major revisions, but we've got all these people who are saying either revise and resubmit or reject, and we're just not into it." So because of that, don't feel bad if you really believe in the piece and you think that you've got a case to be made for how innovative your piece is, whether it's the methods of the piece, whether it's something where it makes a really unique contribution. Don't be afraid to really put yourself on the line and explain very respectfully why you would like another round of peer review on the piece. Now, you're really going to have to be very persuasive here. And obviously, depending on the piece that you're submitting, or that you submitted rather, it's really going to, the nature of the piece is going to determine how you should respond. If it's, for example, like a single case study versus a massive, tens of thousands of people epidemiological study, or a meta-analysis, some kind of review, it's really going to change the dynamic of how you're going to argue for this. If you have a particular case that you want to discuss, later on I'll give you the website where you can sign up for a free consultation call with me, and we can talk about best strategies for you and your particular piece. And finally, tip number 10 is to save your responses. Sure, maybe your piece ends up getting rejected. You're going to feel frustrated. You're going to feel like you've wasted your time. That's normal, especially if the peer review took a very long time, or if you had multiple rounds, whatever it is. Try not to get too pissed off, even though that's natural. And it's a blessing to be able to have, all of those comments in the itemized responses, because upon subsequent submissions, you may get the same comments. And because of that, you can just kind of copy and paste those responses. Although if the responses weren't accepted, you may want to consider tweaking them a little bit in case you're not satisfied, or you think that your response had something to do with the piece not getting accepted the first time. And also, obviously, if you've submitted the piece one time and you've got those reviewer comments, you can really have that piece have been significantly strengthened by those comments. So really don't take it for granted that you've put that effort in. Alright y'all, thank you so much for watching this episode. I really enjoy speaking to you as always, and I want to hear from you in the comments below. Do you have a particular strategy that you use when it comes to responding to reviewer comments? And what have you found to be the things that work best, or maybe work worst for you based on your experience? Let's go ahead and share that knowledge. I want to make sure to get that discussion going. So please do join me, post, and let's talk about it. Don't forget to like and share this video with your friends, with your colleagues, with your students. Subscribe to this channel and follow us on social media. We'd love to have you. If you're interested in a one-on-one coaching session in terms of your career, in terms of peer-reviewed publications, and how to maximize the likelihood that your piece can get published in a leading journal, see a consultation call with me via the website below. Alright y'all, I'm signing off for the day. Have a great one, and remember to get out there, take chances, and be your best self. Thank you so much for stopping by, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here as always. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more in this series on navigating academia, please click on one of these links over here to be able to view more original content. I hope to see you there.